Snow Maiden by Kirill Bulychev. Originally published in the author's Russian language in a collection of his stories in 1975, it next appeared in an English translation of a different set of stories called Half a Life and Other Stories in 1977. Then followed a Dutch collection in 1979, Hungarian in 1983, a Soviet magazine issued in both Russian and English language in 1984, a Portuguese collection in 1986, Romanian in 1992, and a Spanish-language online magazine in 2022. Read by Daryl T. Smith II for my channel Quasar Spectra. The artwork seen during the story is by Kirill's wife, Kira Soshinskaya, which accompanied it in the original 1975 publication. Snow Maiden. Only once did I see a ship die. It is not as terrifying as it sounds because the reality of it doesn't register quickly enough to shake you up. From the bridge of our launch, we watched them trying to land on the planet. For a moment it seemed they would make it, but they were coming in too fast. The ship touched the bottom of a sloping hollow and continued to move as if determined to penetrate the rock wall. But the rock face refused to submit to metal. The ship began to disintegrate like a drop of water splattering on glass. It slowed down. Various parts broke off sluggishly and soundlessly from the ship's body and, scattering over the valley like dark blotches, searched for a convenient place to land and die. Seconds later, its seemingly interminable motion had ceased. The ship was dead, and only then did my brain belatedly reconstruct the thunder of splitting bulkheads, the groans of tearing metal, and the screaming air. The living creatures aboard the ship probably never heard more than the very beginning of these sounds. A ruptured black egg, greatly enlarged, appeared on the screen, and patches of frozen albumin surrounded it like a quaint border. "It's all over," someone remarked. We had received the ship's distress signal and almost reached it in time. We saw it perish. The scale and horror of this spectacle did not strike home until we had lowered the launch and stepped out into the valley, where, at close range, it acquired human proportions. The dark blotches turned into chunks of metal the size of a volleyball court, the engine parts, nozzles, and sections of the braking shafts into the broken toys of a giant. It looked as though someone had thrust a gigantic paw into the ship and disemboweled it. About 50 yards from the ship, we found a girl. She was wearing a spacesuit. All aboard, except the captain and the watch officer, had managed to don their gear. Obviously, the girl had been close to the hatch, which tore off on impact. She was thrown clear of the ship, like an air bubble fizzing off a goblet of mineral water. The miracle of her survival was another of those flukes that have occurred repeatedly since man took to the air. People have fallen from planes 5 miles above the earth and managed to land almost unscathed on steep, snow-covered slopes or in the tops of pine trees. When we carried the girl onto the launch, she was in shock, and Dr. Strezhny would not let me remove her helmet, although we all realized she might die if she didn't receive medical attention. The doctor was right. We knew nothing about the composition of their atmosphere, nor did we know what sort of viruses, deadly for us but harmless for her, lurked in her fair, shiny, bobbed hair. I should describe the girl and explain why I, and everyone else, considered the doctor's fears not only exaggerated, but of no real significance. We normally associate danger with creatures whose appearance is disturbing to us. As far back as the 20th century, a psychologist stated that he had developed a reliable test for astronauts venturing to remote planets. The subject had only to be confronted by a repulsive-looking 6-yard-long spider. The subject's instinctive reaction would be to draw his blaster and empty a full charge into the spider. But the spider could very well prove to be a local poet wandering about in solitude, discharging his responsibilities as secretary of the Voluntary Society for the Protection of Birds and Butterflies. To expect anything insidious from this slender girl, whose long eyelashes cast a shadow on her pale, delicate cheeks, whose face stirred in each and every one of us an overwhelming desire to see the color of her eyes, to expect anything insidious from this girl, even in the form of viruses, would have seemed most unchivalrous. Although no one actually said as much, we all sensed that Dr. Strezhny felt like a scoundrel, like a petty bureaucrat intent on carrying out his instructions to the letter, who was denying an invalid permission to receive a visitor. I wasn't present when the doctor sterilized the probe he would use to pierce the spacesuit and collect an air sample, nor did I learn the results of his efforts immediately, because we had left our ship for another trip to the wreck to look for another miracle, another survivor. It was a hopeless task, but one of those hopeless tasks you feel compelled to pursue to the bitter end. "Looks bad," said the doctor. We heard his prognosis through our earphones while we were trying to get inside the wreck. What we were attempting was rough because the ship's crumpled wall hung over us like a basketball over a bunch of flies. "What's wrong with her?" "She's still alive," said the doctor, "but we can't help her. She's a snow maiden." Our doctor is inclined to couch his comparisons in poetic terms, but their transparency is not always apparent to the uninitiated. Yet the comparison of the girl to the snow maiden of folklore, the girl made of snow who came to life only to melt under the rays of the sun, proved to be particularly apt. "We are accustomed," continued the doctor, "to accept water as the basis of life. She has ammonia." The significance of his words didn't sink in at once. "At earth pressure," said the doctor, "ammonia boils at minus 33 centigrade and freezes at minus 78. Then everything became clear. Since my earphones were now silent, I figured they were looking at the girl. For them, she had become a phantom who would dissolve into a cloud of steam if her helmet were removed. Navigator Bauer chose a most inappropriate time to demonstrate his erudition. "It is theoretically predictable. The atomic weight of ammonia is 17, water 18. Their specific heat is almost identical. Ammonia, which is as light as water, readily gives up a proton. It is an excellent solvent." I have always envied people who, without digging into reference books, can rattle off facts that are never used, or hardly ever. "But at low temperatures, ammonium proteins would be too stable," objected the doctor, as if the girl were merely a theoretical construct, a model generated by Gleb Bauer's imagination. No one replied to his objection. We spent about an hour and a half sifting through the wrecked ship's compartments before we found a tank of ammonium gas mixture intact. A miracle, but nowhere as great as the one that had occurred earlier. I dropped in at the sick bay as I usually did after I came off watch. It reeked of ammonia. In fact, our entire ship did. There was no way to fight the odor. The doctor had a hacking cough. He was seated before a long row of flasks, test tubes, and tanks. Hoses and pipes protruded from some of them and disappeared into a partition. Above the porthole was a loudspeaker translator device. "Is she asleep?" I asked. "No, she's asked for you already," said the doctor. His voice sounded muffled and querulous. The lower part of his face was covered by a mask. Each day he had to tackle several almost insoluble problems related to his patient's nutritional, medical, and psychological needs. His boundless pride exacerbated his querulousness. We had been flying for over 2 weeks, and Snow Maiden was healthy, but desperately lonely. My eyes burned and my throat tickled. Sure, I could have improvised a mask, but it would have made me seem too squeamish. If I were in Snow Maiden's place, I would certainly be upset if my hosts approached me wearing gas masks. The oval porthole framed Snow Maiden's face like an old-fashioned portrait. "Hello?" she said. Then, having exhausted almost her entire vocabulary, she switched on the translator. She knew I liked to hear her real voice now and then, so before turning on the translator, she would say something directly to me. "What have you been doing?" I asked. The soundproofing was poor, so I could hear her chatter coming from behind the partition. Her lips moved, and several seconds elapsed before her words reached me through the translator, permitting me to enjoy her face and the shifting of the pupils of her eyes, which changed color like the sea on a cloudy, windy day. "I remember what my mother taught me," said Snow Maiden in the translator's cold, expressionless voice. "I never thought I would have to prepare my own food. I thought Mother was ridiculous, but now the things she taught me have come in handy." Snow Maiden laughed before the translator had processed her words. "I'm learning to read now, too," she told me. "I know. Do you remember the letter Y? It's a very funny-looking letter, but F is even funnier. You know I broke one little book." Turning his face away from the stinking vapor coming from a test tube, the doctor raised his head and said, "You should have thought twice before giving her a book. At -50, the plastic pages become brittle." "That's what happened," said Snow Maiden. When the doctor had gone, Snow Maiden and I stood there facing each other. The glass felt cold to my touch. To her it seemed almost hot. We had 40 minutes alone before Bauer would return with his dictaphone and begin tormenting Snow Maiden with his endless questions. "How does this function on your planet? And that? How does such and such reaction proceed under your conditions?" Snow Maiden would mimic Bauer amusingly and complain to me, "After all, I'm not a biologist. I could make a mistake, and later it could prove very embarrassing." I brought her pictures and photographs of people, cities, and plants. She would laugh and question me about details that to me seemed so trivial. Then her questions would cease abruptly, and she would look past me dreamily. "What's the matter?" "I'm lonely and afraid." "Don't worry, we'll get you home." "That's not the reason." On that particular day she asked me, "Do you have a picture of her?" "Of whom?" I asked. "The girl waiting for you at home." "No one's waiting for me." "That's not true," said Snow Maiden. She could be terribly dogmatic, especially when she didn't believe something. For example, she didn't believe in roses. "Why don't you believe me?" Snow Maiden didn't reply. The cloud drifting above the sea hid the sun, and the waves changed color, turning cold and gray. But the water close to shore remained green. Snow Maiden could not conceal her mood and thoughts. When she was in good spirits, her eyes were blue, even violet. But when she was sad, they faded at once, turning gray, and anger would turn them green. The day she opened her eyes for the first time aboard our ship, she was in pain. I shouldn't have looked at her eyes. They were black and bottomless, and we could do nothing for her until we had equipped our laboratory to fit her needs. The way we rushed to finish the job, as though the ship was about to explode, and she had remained silent. Only about 3 hours later were we able to transfer her to the laboratory. The doctor had remained with her and helped her remove her helmet. The following morning her eyes had become limpid lilac pools, shining with curiosity, but they had darkened imperceptibly when they had met my gaze. Bauer entered earlier than usual and seemed very happy. Snow Maiden smiled at him and said, "The aquarium is at your service." "I don't know what you mean, Snow Maiden," said Bauer. "And your aquarium contains a fish for you to dissect? I would say an exotic goldfish for me to admire." Bauer isn't easily rattled. Snow Maiden's gray-eye moods were occurring with increasing frequency. Was that so surprising for someone confined for weeks in a 6-by-9-foot chamber? Her comparison to an aquarium was very apt. "I must be going," I said, but Snow Maiden did not respond with her usual plea to hurry back. Her gray eyes looked at Gleb in anguish. I tried to analyze my emotional state, aware of how unrealistic it was, like falling in love with a portrait of Mary, Queen of Scots, or a statue of Nefertiti. Perhaps it was no more than pity for a lonely creature whose dependency on us had, in a surprising manner, made life pleasanter for everyone aboard. She had brought something fine into our lives which compelled us, like a boy before his first date, to smarten up our personal appearance and display greater kindness and generosity. The obvious hopelessness of my infatuation evoked in my fellow crew members a feeling midway between pity and envy, incompatible as such feelings may be. At times I wished that someone would taunt me, do something to get me angry and make me explode. But no one took such liberties. My comrades saw me as blissfully dotty, and this separated and isolated me from them. That evening, Dr. Strezhny called me on the intercom. "Snow Maiden is asking for you." "Is anything wrong?" "Nothing. Don't worry." I ran to the sick bay where Snow Maiden was waiting for me at the porthole. "Sorry to bother you," she said, "but it suddenly occurred to me that if I should die, I wouldn't see you again." "Nonsense, you're not going to die," muttered the doctor. My gaze shifted involuntarily to the dials on the equipment. "Stay for a while," Snow Maiden said to me. The doctor invented some excuse to leave. "I want to touch you," said Snow Maiden. "It doesn't seem fair that I can't touch you without burning myself." "It's easier for me," I said stupidly. "I'll only get frostbite." "Are we almost there?" "Yes, 4 more days. I don't want to go home, because while I'm here I can imagine that I'm touching you. I wouldn't have you there. Lay your palm against the pane." I obeyed. Snow Maiden pressed her forehead against the glass, and I imagined that my fingers were penetrating the transparent mass of glass and touching her. Snow Maiden raised her head and tried to smile. "Did you freeze your fingers?" "We must find a neutral planet," I said. "What kind?" "A neutral one, in between, with a constant temperature of -40. "That's too hot." "All right, then -45. Can you take that?" "Of course," said Snow Maiden. "But that wouldn't be any way to live, always uncomfortable, merely tolerating our environment." "I was only joking." "I know you were." "I won't be able to write to you," I said. I'd need special paper that wouldn't crumble, and then there's that odor. How does water smell? Doesn't it smell to you?" asked Snow Maiden. "Not at all." "How amazing!" "There, you see, you've cheered up," I said. "Would I fall in love with you if our blood were the same?" "I don't know. At the beginning, I fell in love with you, but then I realized we could never live together." "Thank you." Snow Maiden was excited on the last day, and although she told me that she couldn't imagine parting with us, with me, her thoughts darted about, flitting from one thing to another. Later, when I was packing her belongings in the laboratory, she confessed that she feared the end of the journey more than anything else. She was torn between me, whom she must leave behind, and the whole world that was waiting for her. Her People's Patrol ship had been escorting us for the past half hour, and the translator on the captain's bridge kept crackling away, processing their language with difficulty. Bauer entered the laboratory and announced that we were coming in for a landing at the spaceport. He tried to read the name of it. Snow Maiden corrected his pronunciation and then asked if he had checked her spacesuit thoroughly. "I'll check it right away," said Gleb. "What are you afraid of? You've no more than 30 steps to go." "I want to be sure I make them," said Snow Maiden, unaware that she had offended Gleb. She turned to me. "Will you check it again?" she asked. "All right," I replied. Gleb shrugged his shoulders and left. 3 minutes later he returned and put her spacesuit on the table. The tanks thumped softly against the plastic, and Snow Maiden winced as if she had been struck. Then she rapped on the little door of the forward chamber. "Give me the spacesuit. I'll check it myself." The wall that had sprung up between us crushed me. My head felt as if it were in a vice. I knew that we were parting, but that we must not part like this. We made a soft landing. Snow Maiden was in her spacesuit. I thought she would leave the laboratory earlier, but she wouldn't risk it until she heard the captain's voice over the intercom. "Landing party, get into spacesuits. Outside temperature is -53. The hatch was open, and those who wished to say goodbye again to Snow Maiden waited beside it. While she spoke with the doctor, I caught up with her and went out on deck toward the ramp. Low clouds drifted above this very strange world. A squat yellow car halted about 30 meters away, and several people stood beside it on stone slabs. They weren't wearing spacesuits. Why should they in their own home? The small welcoming crowd seemed lost in the vastness of the spaceport's endless field. Another car pulled up, and its passengers stepped out. I heard Snow Maiden approaching me and turned around. The others withdrew and left us alone. Snow Maiden wasn't looking at me. She was scanning the crowd for a familiar face. Suddenly she spied it, raised her hand, and waved. A woman separated herself from the crowd and ran along the slabs toward the ramp. Snow Maiden rushed down to meet her. I stood there because I was the only one on the ship who hadn't said a last goodbye to Snow Maiden. Besides, I was holding a large bundle of her belongings. Finally, I was included in the landing party and had to accompany Bauer for his negotiations with the spaceport authorities. We couldn't hang around here too long. We would have to depart in an hour. The woman said something to Snow Maiden, who laughed and flung off her helmet, which fell down and rolled along the slabs. Snow Maiden ran her hand through her hair. I watched as the woman pressed her cheek to Snow Maiden and thought that both of them probably felt warm. Snow Maiden said something to the woman and suddenly ran back to the ship. As she ascended the ramp, she looked at me and pulled off her gloves. "Forgive me," she said. "I didn't say goodbye to you." It wasn't her voice, but the translator above the hatch, which one of the crew had prudently switched on. but I heard her voice too. "Take off your glove," she said. "It's only -50 here." I unfastened a glove and no one stopped me, although the captain and doctor had heard and understood her words. I didn't feel the cold, neither then nor when she took my hand and pressed it to her cheek for an instant. I pulled back my palm, but it was too late. My hand had left a purple outline on her scorched cheek. "It's all right," said Snow Maiden, swinging her arms to relieve the pain. "It will pass. If it doesn't, so much the better." "Are you out of your mind?" I said. "Put on your glove. You'll get frostbite," said Snow Maiden. She looked at me, and her dark blue, almost black eyes were completely dry. Snow Maiden returned to the woman, and they walked toward the car. When they reached it, Snow Maiden halted and raised her hand to wave goodbye to me and the rest of the crew. The doctor turned to me. "Drop in later to see me," he said. "I'll put some salve on your hand and bandage it." "It doesn't hurt," I assured him. "It will later," said the doctor. You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.